Hmm. I wanted to ask you, Professor Jiang, about you made a comment about Greater Israel and the attempt to achieve it. Um, where do you see that now, given that Iran doesn't seem like it's on the verge of collapse? It seems like its government is very much intact, and now even the collective West is admitting this. And I think Europe is on the phone with Iran right now, trying to get a deal to move their cargo and their commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. But also, Israel is in heavy fighting with Hezbollah, and part of the Greater Israel Project will also include Iraq, and we see the resistance downing refueling tankers. So there's certainly opposition to this, and we haven't even gone into Yemen yet with what could happen if the Bab el-Mandeb is closed. So where do you make of where the Greater Israel Project is right now and how that will take shape in the days and weeks to come?
Okay, so Israel is a very difficult nation to understand because of their theology, because of their understanding of their place in the world. They call themselves God's chosen people. Okay, so from an Israeli perspective, okay, if you are a religious extremist, this war is going according to God's plan. Because how do you achieve the Greater Israel Project? Well, you achieve the Greater Israel Project by removing America from the Middle East. And you achieve the Greater Israel Project by basically destroying the GCC. And ultimately, to achieve the Greater Israel Project, you'll eventually have to go after Turkey and Egypt as well. Because around the Greater Israel, if you see a map, it actually extends from the Nile to the Euphrates. Iran is actually not part of Greater Israel. Okay, so in other words, these religious extremists want this war in the Middle East in order to move forward, to accelerate the Greater Israel Project, which they believe is what God promised them through their ancestor Abraham. Okay, so in other words, from an Israeli perspective, your real objectives in this war is not to defeat Iran. Okay, you want to weaken Iran, but it's not really feasible for you as a small nation to defeat Iran. Okay, so what are your real military objectives that you can actually say? Well, first of all, it's to destroy the American empire and force Americans out of the Middle East. It's to destroy Saudi Arabia, because actually part of Saudi Arabia is a part of the Greater Israel Project, and to drag Turkey into this war, because the south of Anatolia, Turkey, is actually part of the Greater Israel Project as well. So that's what you want to do. And if this war drags on, and the American sends in ground troops, then you're actually accelerating God's plan. Also, what people don't recognize is that this destruction in Israel, these religious extremists think that it is the will of God. Okay, so where are the Iranians striking? Tel Aviv. Where are they not striking, really? Jerusalem. There's a huge difference between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. People don't really appreciate.
Oh, sorry. That was a mistake.
People don't really appreciate the political dynamic in Tel Aviv. Jerusalem and people don't really appreciate the political dynamic in Israel. Tel Aviv and Jerusalem are two opposing centers of gravity in Israel. Tel Aviv is the Western-looking, the open, the cosmopolitan, the secular, democratic version or face of Israel. Jerusalem is the inward-looking, the religious, theocratic, conservative face of Israel. And guess what? They hate each other. And if Tel Aviv were to be destroyed, okay, meaning like the open, cosmopolitan, democratic secular Israel would be destroyed in this war, good, because that is God's will. God doesn't want these, open Western Jews in Israel. He wants them to repent. He wants them to engage in redemption. And in the Jewish theology, redemption is only possible through pain, suffering. Okay, you need to commit sin in order to force God to punish you, and then you engage in a long process of self-reflection, self-revitalization in order to fully embrace God. Okay, so in other words, these religious extremists are hoping to use this war to inflict so much damage and pain on secular Israel that they see the error of their ways and they embrace God fully. And if you don't do so, well, then go away, go back to Europe, go back to America. Who cares? Okay, but Israel, they want Israel to become a theocracy because of this war. So I know it's hard to understand because most of us are not religious, and when we hear this, we think it's all insane. But unfortunately, right now, the religious fanatics have control over the national security apparatus, the military of Israel, and they want to use this war in order to bring the Jewish people closer to God. And they believe that by doing so, this will accelerate the coming of the Messiah and usher in the Messianic age. So from their perspective, it's all going according to plan. And they have some surprises in store for the world. For example, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which I think may be destroyed in this war.
Well, also, Professor Jiang, the U.S. military has been infected by this kind of religious extremism. You've probably seen the reports of 200 plus complaints from the Military Religious Freedom Foundation by U.S. troops saying that they were told that this war was all part of God's divine plan, and they were told there were multiple references to the Book of Revelation referring to Armageddon and the imminent return of Jesus Christ because of this war. So, I think a lot of people are interested, Professor Jiang, in hearing your take on how this religious extremism we see, and this is when we talk Israel and of course the collective West, it's getting worse and worse, contrary to how people view Iran actually. And I'm wondering how you see that affecting not just this war, but also the world as these changes, the end of unipolar dominance by the United States really becomes much more apparent from this war, and of course, in the coming days and weeks.
Right. So I've always argued that this war is eschatological. Okay, meaning you can't really explain this war from a purely geopolitical lens. Yes, I do know that I spent the early part of this discussion talking about why empire needs to engage in war, but there are alternatives to what they're doing. Okay, so the first alternative is just become friends with Iran. Remove the sanctions, return to the nuclear deal, the Obama era nuclear deal, and engage in trade with Iran. And look, the Iranians are pragmatic people. They would welcome American investment. They would welcome the opportunity to sell their oil to America. Okay, that's your first option. But if you don't want to do that option, then you can also choose a strategy of economic strangulation, meaning that you basically embargo Iran. Iran sells most of its oil to China, and that's a shadow fleet. Well, you can embargo Iran because if you look at the map, there are American military bases everywhere, right? So you have options. The worst thing you can do is actually go and attack Iran, because then you find yourself in this sort of situation where now you're losing the war and you're forced to send in ground troops if you are to win this war. And we've already discussed why that would be suicidal, both militarily, economically, and politically. So then the question then is, why did they pick the worst option? And it's eschatological, where there are people in the United States, and these are secret societies, and these are different secret societies who believe this. But they believe that a war in the Middle East, once it's started, it will create a chain of events that will lead eventually to the end of the world, the end times. And for different secret societies, this could mean different things. Okay, so for the Freemasons, it would mean the creation of Pax Judaica, a one world government, and the coming of an AI surveillance state, where Jerusalem is the center of the world. Okay, then you have these Messianic Jews called the Shabbat Lubavitch movement, and there are others as well. Okay, but the most famous, who believe that this war will initiate something called the War of Gog and Magog, which is really the final battle of humanity, where the world basically attacks Israel, and and this will force the the coming of their Messiah, the intervention of God, basically, and the coming of the Messianic age, where God will live with his people, the Jews. And then the Christian Zionists who believe that this war will initiate the war of Gog and Magog, and then Jesus will return to save Israel from its enemies. And then all Christians who believe in Jesus will be raptured up into heaven before Jesus ushers in the millennium, the Messianic age, and then you have the final day of judgment, okay? So I understand this is sort of like bonkers, but I mean, most people in this world happen to be religious. Christian Zionism is about a quarter of the population of America. You have this movement called Christians United for Israel, 7 million members, and their only goal, 7 million members, their only goal is to ensure that American politicians help bring about the end of days. And these are the people who actually are funding these West Bank settlements, which are clearly against international law, right? So you have all these Israeli settlers in the West Bank who don't actually work, and they have like large families. It's all being funded by Christians United for Israel and other Christian Zionists. So this plan has been in motion for decades. I would argue even for centuries. Okay, so they want to usher in the end of days, and so there are certain things that will happen that will surprise people, and it makes absolutely no sense. But it's all according to their theology, their eschatology, okay? So what will happen eventually is the Al-Aqsa Mosque will be destroyed. And in fact, there's been discussions on social media how this will happen. Basically, the idea is, okay, for the past few years, they've been conducting archaeological digs under the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in Islam, by the way. And so the foundations of the Al-Aqsa Mosque are very unstable. And so basically, if an Iranian missile goes astray, and we won't actually know if it's an Iranian missile, but of course we blame on the Iranians, then there'll be a controlled demolition of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Okay, so again, look, it's all speculation, it's all rumors, but if it were to happen, then you will know that it's all for eschatological purposes. And of course, and also like this is hard for people to understand, but anti-Semitism, the rise of anti-Semitism in the Western world is also part of this eschatology, because in both the Jewish and Christian eschatological understanding of things, the Jews must return to Jerusalem to seek redemption, to seek to seek the love of God, to unify with God. And that basically means bringing the Jewish diaspora back to Jerusalem. Now, as you know, many Jews in the Western world live very nice lives. They're very successful.
Oh, you froze, Professor Jiang. You said they're very successful. If you come back.
Yeah, so,
there you go.
So they're successful, and then they won't come back voluntarily. Well, then you make them. And again, I know this sounds crazy, but please remember, this war in Iran is crazy. It makes absolutely no sense why the Americans are fighting the war the way they are. And it like honestly, it doesn't seem as though Trump and his people really care. And their response to this growing unpopularity of this war in America is maybe to institute a national draft. There's talk of deploying the National Guard to quell unrest throughout throughout America. Like Trump's cabinet has basically moved on to American military bases, and the people that would be most responsible for a national draft and the sending of the National Guard, people like Pete Hegseth and Stephen Miller and Christy Noem, they've all moved to American military bases. And why would they do that? Okay, so it seems as though something is being prepared for America.